you for joining our Faculty of Agricultural and Food Sciences conversation today. My name is Erika Vernorst, and I'm the Associate Dean Research in the faculty. The title of today's conversation is Indigenous Engagement and Leadership in Science. I would like to acknowledge that the University of Manitoba is located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We are acknowledging the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to moving forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. This is already our fourth faculty seminar in a virtual format, and if you missed one or more of the previous seminars, there is an opportunity for you to view them all via our faculty's YouTube channel. As another option, you can also find links to our seminars at our wonderful knowledge translation portal called Manitoba Agriculture and Food Exchange. And for your reference, you can see the website address here on your screen. Make Manitoba highlights the faculty's research as it relates to consumers and producers, and we do so through podcasts, infographics, fact sheets, and even delicious recipes. So please check it out. Today, we have lined up 3 speakers who would share with us a short summary of their research and then engage together in a conversation. And you as a viewer can be part of this conversation by sending in your questions and comments via the chat platform. And right now, I would like to call upon Crystal Jurgensen, who is the faculty's communication specialist, to provide some guidance on how the audience can participate in today's presentation. Crystal, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Erika. For our viewers today, we invite you to participate by sending in your questions via the chat platform. Slido or slido.com is how you get to it, and you'll see it at the bottom of your screen there. And here you're going to use the event code #IndigSci, INDIGSCI. The character limit is a bit short here, so we ask that you keep your comments or your questions fairly succinct. And to kick it off, why don't you let us know where you're tuning in from? And I'll throw it back to you, Erika.
Thanks, Crystal. And perhaps we can review those instructions again when we get to the questions and answer section of this seminar. So as noted earlier, the topic today explores Indigenous engagement and leadership in science. And this topic is very dear to my heart. I've been working with First Nations communities, collaborating on water research since 2013, as well as I'm a board member of the Verna Kirkness Education Foundation. And this foundation has the goal to increase the number of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit students graduating from post-secondary science programs. Today's speakers have a specific interest in food systems, Indigenous community capacity building, and ecological and environmental sciences. Today, they will share their thoughts on how researchers and communities can engage to share knowledge, drive policy, and direct future research. With that, I would like to introduce to you today the guests. First of all, please welcome Kyle Bobiwash. Kyle received his MSc at McGill University and his PhD at Simon Fraser University, where he studied pollination ecology of high bush blueberry in British Columbia. Today, he is one of my colleagues and an assistant professor in the Department of Entomology at the University of Manitoba. He is the inaugural Indigenous scholar of our faculty. Kyle's research focuses on understanding the ecology of beneficial insects in natural and agroecosystems, and in doing so, Kyle characterizes land, plant, and insect networks and their interactions with an overall aim to conserve insect communities and ecosystem services. So with that, welcome, Kyle, and I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Yeah. So thanks to Amika, but big thanks to Emily and Erica who are joining me, because when Crystal first asked me to do this, before she even finished, I was ready to say no until I heard that I could bring in colleagues and friends, and after that, I was much more amenable, knowing that I can pass off those hard questions to them. So I wanted to put my conclusion slide up front right away, just in case I go over time or end up going off on some tangent. But the main message that I'd like everyone to take away today might seem a bit counterintuitive, but I think it's a nice way to reconsider how we do things. We know we can go through, one by one, all sorts of different health, social, economic, ecological indicators, and list a multitude of issues, problems, or inequities that Indigenous peoples face in Canada. So adding more or building more of these issues might seem a little crazy. But why I'm trying to encourage us all today to think this way a little bit is that if we do this, we might be able to improve the impact and kickstart that potential change here in academia. And of course, I'm going to use pollinators as an example, just to help kind of center and contextualize this a little bit. When we look at bee records across Manitoba, represented by my cute little bee icons here, we should see a pattern fairly quickly. One, there's a geographic variability of where we're finding bees, right? This makes sense in terms of access, how expensive, research cost, how expensive it is to survey in the north. But something we should also be able to see is just how visible these red splotches or pixels are. These represent defined Indigenous communities, not just traditional territories. So already you can, see the gears in my mind working. It's oh man, we can use Indigenous communities and, build that capacity to, start monitoring ecological networks. And I've also always been intrigued by, papers, especially these 3 papers outlining the reliance on many communities, not just for agriculture or pure calories, but on, they're reliant on healthy pollinator communities to make sure that they're actually accessing nutritious calories, right? These food products that provide micronutrients that are hard to get in through other means. So to me, my initial idea when I first got here was really crystal clear, right? We have increasing Indigenous populations, likely resulting in both increases in the importance of food security and the need to maintain ecological networks that support these food systems. And all these might face the same risks or those same stresses through increasingly intense land use that's happening because of this increase in population. So the goal was relatively simple, right? To maintain ecological functions, pollination, for example, to make sure that land-based resources being used to either fulfill or supplement the nutritional balance of local food systems are maintained. So, again, easy idea. Through building insect monitoring networks and landscape scale best management practices, we can contribute to happy biodiversity that supports a sustainable, nutritive agroecological landscape. Again, that supports happier and healthier Indigenous peoples, here represented by my really cool Snoopy that I found. A simple idea that could have all sorts of benefits to everyone and build all sorts of partnerships. But when we brought people from these northern communities down to the university, it soon became apparent how much more complex the problems and their issues were. Right? They thought the initial idea made tons of sense. Of course, that's so obvious. Ecosystem health, human health. We know that's really tightly linked. But, what I thought the issue should be, right? Biodiversity stuff, blah, 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 conservation. That was only a really small piece or a really minor link or small chain in the system of change that connects Indigenous peoples to the land and their local food systems. The conversations that we had when all these Indigenous communities came down to the university ranged from inequity in wildlife enforcement, loss of access to traditional lands, inequities in technology or availability of technology, limited options to actually engage and be involved in what we consider to be the contemporary economy, and of course, the persistent abuse and neglect that Indigenous peoples face. These were the topics that really made people excited and fired up. Right, they were much more excited by these topics than catching bees and picking berries with me all summer long. And and to some extent, that was a major whiff on my part in how I presented it. And I think despite the progress that has been made, that we're making as a society or as a field in general, as science, we are just at the beginning of getting over this colonial hangover. We're just rolling out of bed. We're just realizing that, it might be a good idea to actually have the perspectives and knowledges of those hundreds of nations across Canada, many whose stolen land we benefit from every day, as not only something else we need to consider in the science and the work that we're doing, but as a foundational pillar of the legislation, the policy, as well as how we think about our fields being as objective and effective to drive those changes that we need to see in contemporary society these days. And again, yes, we can identify problems by the boatload, and we may even have really good solutions to a lot of these symptoms. But it's also important to consider that, consider the larger picture when we go about our work to actually affect those causes. And here, this is one of my favorite examples, this Peel watershed, which is now better protected and managed because of the work of people like Elijah Smith here. There are large structural changes that needed to take place for them to allow better protection and better management of this system. So I think these things need to be similarly reflected in our work in science or how we administer the systems that use science as evidence. And being February, I'd be remiss not to think about everything that has influenced me. The fact that we're still stuck where we are now as a country or an institution sucks, right? We should know better by now. I often look back at that bee and food security project thinking I should have known a little bit better. And, and I often talk about, Forgotten Pollinators as this one really influential book to me when I was growing up. Around the same time, a re-release of the Malcolm X autobiography came out because of Spike Lee's movie at the time. And I had stole this book from my older sister. She's about 10 years older than me. And I always, looked up to her for information, right? She was already in an environmental engineering program. She had all sorts of cool things I can steal from her once she moved out. So I was, really hip with it. I was able to benefit from her experience. But to some extent, it was her trajectory that continues to influence me on how I think a lot about these issues, especially with the greatest value of her degree coming in the form of having to work for fossil fuel companies post-graduation of her environmental engineering program. And to me, this is the crux of the problem that's the hardest to tackle. We've been talking about structural inequities, racism, equality, all these things for decades. I even have a cousin that I don't really know that well, who was an anti-fascist, anti-racist educator. He was a frontline activist. He fought against far-right and anti-Semitic groups back in the 80s and 90s. And to see the fact that we're still in these battles today is really somewhat disheartening. Right. And it's always easy to blame the people in these groups. But I think what we do poorly is address the structural assumptions of our society that have not necessarily changed. And we're in a period right now where, historical artifacts and these ideologies of a time gone by are still embedded not only in our society, but in those institutions, in all of our institutions. So highlighting my favorite W.E.B. Du Bois quote right here, I think we need to be thankful that Indigenous communities themselves still see institutions based on Western education models as a way to the future, despite their contributions to continued colonialism. And, and in my opinion, as such, we have a duty, no matter what our field is, to contribute to bigger societal change.
Thank you so much, Kyle, for presenting and those wonderful comments and dialogue. So next up, I would welcome Emily Missyabit McCullen. And Emily is a member of Lake Manitoba First Nation. She received an MSc in biology from Carleton University in 2009 and a PhD in biological sciences from Simon Fraser University in 2020. Belated congratulations for being awarded the PhD. So Emily's research interests include food web interactions, species distribution modeling, citizen science, indigenous knowledge systems, and ecological interactions. From 2017 to January 2021, Emily was the Senior Indigenous Science Liaison Officer for the Science and Technology branch at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. She is still with the same organization, but now in a new position because she was just appointed the director of AFC's Indigenous Science Liaison Office, as well as the Interdepartmental Indigenous Science Technology Engineering Mathematics Cluster. So with that, Emily, thank you for being here with us, and I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Kachimigwich, thanks very much for having me. Emily Missyabit MacAuley, Indigenous Odawa Ndunji. My name is Emily Missyabit MacAuley, and I am a member of Lake Manitoba First Nation. I'm also the daughter of a 60s scoop survivor, so I was actually born and raised here in Ottawa, and I'm just going to be talking mainly today about my own personal experience, exploring my own Indigenous identity and also walking in both worlds, including that of my formal Western scientific training. So I did take quite a few years in grad school to, sort of finish that master's degree, which was at Carleton University, and that was in sexual selection theory, which was really, it was quite an exciting area for me, very controlled environment as far as behavioral ecology goes, and flew through that one in the requisitioned, sort of allotted time that you're supposed to take to do a master's degree. And then for my PhD, I went to Simon Fraser University, and I wanted to study ecological interactions and sort of be out on the land and learning from the land and connecting to that a little bit more. And that degree took me quite a while to finish, actually, part of which is because I was also working full time. But, I think my experience in grad school, and this is something I want to, kind of talk to you all about today, especially because this event is being hosted by the University of Manitoba. What I found is that the types of supports that I needed from an institution weren't necessarily something that I could find within Simon Fraser University or any other Western institution. And a lot of that, that Western science system that we have here in North America, and also the Western science systems around the world, have really come out of just a few critical thinkers that were, based in Europe, and they're very Eurocentric views. And the institutions and the science and the way that we deliver science in Canada was kind of formed based on those views and grew out of those views. And like Kyle said, we're still kind of we're still in that system today. And so for me, I had a great deal. I was so lucky. Like, I love Western science, and I had an extraordinary amount of wonderful Western scientific mentors throughout grad school. Not a single one of them was prepared to support me fully in sort of reconnecting to my Indigenous identity and some of the struggles that I had as a mixed race woman, sort of coming to terms with being a displaced Indigenous person, being raised in Ottawa in an urban setting away from my traditional lands, my community, not knowing most of my family. And then on the other hand, I did have Indigenous colleagues and friends and family that I did reconnect to, who were incredibly supportive of my cultural reconnection. But there were certainly a lot of questions, of like, how much longer are you going to be in grad school, and doesn't university take a lot of time, and shouldn't you be done by now? And so I just sort of felt like balancing those two worlds was always a huge struggle for me. So when we talk about Indigenous leadership in science, something that I've explored professionally over the last couple of years is really initiating and bringing about that internal organizational culture change that's really needed to bring new voices and new minds into a system that was never included in the development of that system. And in Indigenous peoples, we are chronically and continue to be completely underrepresented in the sciences. It's exactly why I tended to struggle in grad school, was because there was no one around me. There was Kyle, actually. It's funny enough, we did do our PhDs, we overlapped at Simon Fraser, but there weren't a lot of people that I could turn to say, is this what you're going through, and feel validated about that experience. And so, if I could give, some, I guess, unsolicited advice today, it would really be about building those internal relationships inside of organizations and institutions to, as director of the Indigenous Science Liaison Office, we get asked all of the time, how do I engage externally with potential Indigenous partners? And I think, you know, you need to be engaging internally with your existing Indigenous employees and making your department more welcoming, or your organization more welcoming to more Indigenous employees, and building those relationships before you can even start to think about engaging externally. And so a lot of what we've done is to really build in those culturally appropriate supports and be able to offer those supports in both worlds to Indigenous employees that need them. And there's an excellent article out on the internet written by Pam Palmater, who's a Mi'kmaq lawyer, and she gives a number of recommendations that I completely agree with, which we can touch on in the discussion. But my primary one is to never hire a single Indigenous faculty member at a time. You should always be hiring more than one. And the reason for that is because that one Indigenous faculty member is really going to be targeted for absolutely any kind of like reconciliation activity or event, and they're just going to be a bit overwhelmed by that. And the other thing I would say as well is to really, institutions need to deliberately and formally value the community connection that these Indigenous scholars have. A lot of the time we're bringing people in who have community ties, and then we're saying, no, you can't have time off to go back to the land, to go back to community, to reconnect. You can't have special treatment for that, but that's exactly the special expertise and value that we're expecting from these Indigenous scholars. And so those are some of the changes that I'd like to see brought about when we talk about systemic change, and happy to touch on that more in the discussion. Miigwech.
Thank you so much, Emily, and thanks for sharing some of your personal reflections as well. That's always very important to share and hear. So up next, I would like to welcome Erika Oppendorfer. Erika's PhD program and at Carleton, and also her postdoctoral studies at Labrador Institute, focused on cultural plant knowledge and the plant ecology of cultural places. So Erika is currently a cultural botanist with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and she has a focus on circumpolar food systems and biodiversity. She lives and works in Goose Bay, Labrador, homelands of the Inuit and Innu. So with that, Erika, I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Great, thanks, Annemieke. Yeah, sorry, you're getting a bit of the Labradark here. It's a little bit later, so apologize for that. Yeah, good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. Thank you to my co-presenters and to Kyle for his very enthusiastic invitation to join him here today. Yeah, it's great to do it with colleagues, and I echo what Emily said. It's nice to have support for what you're doing and not be the only person whose shoulders are being called upon. So thanks for the support from my colleagues here today. My name's Erika Oberndorfer. I grew up to the west of Tiohtià:ke, the gathering place, also known as Montreal. My background's in plant ecology, and my MSc taught me, among other things, that I needed to do a better job of learning about plants from multiple perspectives. And I really hear what Emily said about knowing that there are other ways to learn and feeling like there was a way to connect to land that was being missed through the avenue that I was learning through. I moved to Labrador permanently in 2012. I had just started a PhD. And since that time, I've been learning about cultural and ecological relationships between people and plants in the Inuit community of MacAuley, which is one of 5 communities on the north shore of Labrador in the Inuit land claims area near Missyabit. I work with Agriculture Canada in northern and Indigenous food systems and biodiversity, and I'm so very fortunate to be in that position from Goose Bay because it allows me to continue long-term relationships with Makivimiut, residents of Makkovik. And being based in Goose Bay, I'm 200 kilometers or so as the crow flies, or 9 hours on Skidoo. So I'm positioned, at least in my job and geographically, to continue that work. And I'm really grateful to the department that they're starting to see some of these systemic changes in terms of kind of opening up geographic opportunities that aren't necessarily based at the doorstep, of a nation's capital or of a, university building. I want to thank the organizers for this topic, Indigenous engagement and leadership in science, and I'm going to focus specifically on engagement and my shifting understanding of it from the context of my own work as a non-Indigenous scientist. This is the first time I've really sat down and thought about the meaning of the word, or the meanings of the word engagement, which is a word that we use quite a lot and a part of research that we encourage quite a lot, especially in terms of promoting academic and government and institutional engagement with Indigenous communities and research. And thinking about the meaning of that terminology made this presentation go in a way more personal direction than I had anticipated or planned or really hoped for, which is generally, of course, terrifying for scientists. And one of the reasons that we go into science is to not have to deal with our feelings, speaking personally. But anyways, I'm going to skip past my terror and go to slide 2. Sorry for this. Teddy has prepared us so well and I just messed up. Okay, here we go. So to talk about engagement and its multiple meanings, the one that's become kind of fixed in the lexicon is one of the most recent ones, which is to effectively to induce to participate, to engage someone in conversation, for example, to attract and maintain someone's attention, to promote their involvement. So at the start, I think this is very much my understanding of engagement, that it was in my hands to engage MacAuley in research. And I would do this through things like presentations and programs and events, in a very episodic sense, things that have a start and an end. So here's an example of one of my favorite, engagement activities in Makkovik. If you're familiar with The Amazing Race, this is a spin on that, The Amazing Plant Race Makkovik. And, it's a series of challenges where racers compete to complete tasks. In this case, it was to successfully build and safely extinguish a fire under the very watchful eye of Anyokuk, or Mayor Barry Anderson, also the fire marshal, which is very handy. So I'm not knocking these kinds of engagement at all, of course. First of all, because things like this are super fun, and also because there are these shared experiences through which people get to know each other, and the basis for forming kind of deeper ties. So, but I will say that more often than not, in this kind of example of engagement, controls with the researcher, it's unidirectional and outward. Essentially, I thought I would be engaging others, and what I had no understanding of at the time, I started engagement activities, so to speak, is how Indigenous engagement would work on me in reverse, and what that would mean for my life. So the way it worked on me is much more in the sense of another kind of engagement, and one with an older meaning, of binding oneself, or pledging oneself, committing oneself, doing one's best over the long term to uphold responsibilities and fulfill obligations. And this is engagement not just as a point of contact with a clear start and end point, but as an ongoing and really infinite process of growing more and more into each other, of becoming enmeshed. So it's me who's become engaged. It's me who needed to be engaged and whose professional and personal spaces needed to become more porous. So what I think I'd like for you to take from this presentation is that when encouraging or promoting Indigenous engagement, it's not to be viewed exclusively as an event or a series of events. It's not an outward-facing tool to be wielded and controlled by non-resident researchers in trying to engage Indigenous communities in one's work. Engagement is something that hopefully over time works on non-Indigenous scientists like me as a lifelong path towards actively practicing those commitments and growing more and more together. And in the process, hopefully this contributes to something more collectively meaningful. So thank you for the opportunity to prepare for this presentation and what it's given me in understanding how Indigenous engagement in science has changed and informed my life. And I hope you've benefited from it in some way too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Erika. I would like to re-invite Kyle and Emily to come on board, and perhaps we can have a conversation together, because that's what our series is called. And maybe to start off, Kyle, you mentioned about aiming for communities to engage in science, and I think it's a wonderful thought what you had on that slide with all the white things, so to speak, there with looks like lights almost. I'm wondering, how do you engage communities? And I'm particularly thinking about communities that are suffering, communities that still do not have clean running drinking water to many of their homes on reserves. So I'm just wondering about your approaches to engage people in science while people are busy trying to survive, including lacking the basic human rights of clean running drinking water.
Yeah, that's always a tricky question in terms of, I think it's somewhat simple sometimes, right? It's like, don't be a jerk. Don't think you know everything, and take the time. And one of the things we don't appreciate is that building that relationship, building those partnerships, even building the ideas, or coming to a common ground of what science is or what research is, takes a lot of work. Right there's all these concepts of 1,000 cups of tea, right? It takes all this meeting, all this work together to actually not only understand what you're talking about in terms of research projects, but to make sure that you're living in the same world, right? I've been in hundreds of Indigenous communities, but I've been in hundreds of Indigenous communities relatively close to city centers, right? They're not suffering the same things that fly-in communities are, right? My dad, he works in all sorts of fly-in communities, and some of these places are these horrible landscapes in terms of they just don't have access to a lot of these drinking water, technology, internet, things that we take for granted, for decades, right? We've really ignored these problems, and there's not a lot of good solutions for them. So not only do we have to kind of reconcile that idea, or those ideas of what we consider to be the most important issues and how to tackle them, but we also have to make this realization that we live in very different worlds, right? And it is being able to share and being able to self-actualize some of that information is really important, because until somebody sees you as actually understanding them, right, there's not really a reason for you to do this. Sure, right, I might get some cool data out of it, right? I might develop a small little nutrition program or something like that. And again, that every little bit helps. I agree, but the major changes that need to take place need to happen at a larger scale, and it's linking multiple Kyles, multiple people, multiple Anamikas, all these grad students together that are really pushing forward a similar idea, not only just to improve those small symptoms, but actually to give people power, give communities power, hold a mirror to the Canadian society to show that these problems are not just these distinct problems. They're part of a larger, structural inequalities that we have seen historically in Canada.
Thanks, Kyle. I don't know if Erika and Emily would like to add to what Kyle was mentioning.
Yeah, I mean, and I guess we're having a bit of a discussion, so I'd kind of throw it to anyone to, I just kind of think about those types of issues, and there's like a whole continuum of co-development with communities, right? And it really starts with building or rebuilding, in some cases, those relationships, and you'll find that your research priorities may not be aligned with their day-to-day priorities, but there's a really long history in all over the world, but in North America, of researchers going into communities, kind of looking at the situation there and taking the data back to Ottawa and developing policy solutions for some of the things that you're talking about, that just once you implemented them without any sort of shared analysis or interpretation with the community that it pertained to, those solutions just didn't work. So I think there's a lot of Yeah, I think it is. It's about a different way of thinking about how do we do our research, and how do we identify shared research priorities, but also, where are we along that continuum of relationship building, and sort of, trying to address some of those issues together in a way that makes sense for each specific situation too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Emily. Another thing what I was wondering about when I was listening to Emily and also Erika, I did hear, I do hear from Indigenous students the experience that Emily shared with us. So that's sort of the two worlds, and academia being very Eurocentric. Kyle mentioned he had a slide with the colonial hangover, and we all know that colonialism still exists, and that there is systemic racism in Canada. And I'm wondering, how do we move this forward? And is the key to decolonize the Eurocentric academia, or is the key to maintain a Eurocentric system to some extent, and then have a more innovative system that thinks differently about science from perhaps a more Indigenous perspective? What do you think are the best directions? Should we have different streams, or should we try to collapse the Eurocentric university and build it up quite differently?
I feel like we're all going to have thoughts on this one too. But I do want to kind of start off on this one just because it's something I think about quite a bit. I think when we think about reconciliation or decolonization, the Western perception is that we need to think about those long-term goals, right? And where are we trying to get to? And from my experience, which is, pretty limited, it's about finding a new way to walk together and to understand each other. And when we start understanding those Indigenous worldviews, and that Indigenous science is just as valid as Western science, and that those Indigenous worldviews are just as valid as Western worldviews, and that really our entire Western science system is predicated on a set of Western worldviews, we can start to act in a different way and start to invite and make space for those voices and those worldviews that are different from Western views. And when we start behaving in a new way, we're going to get somewhere new, but I don't think we're necessarily going to know where we're going to end up. And so for me, reconciliation, like, people are always asking me, what is reconciliation to you? And it's a new way of behaving, and it's not a set of goals. And I see Erika's unmuted herself. So,
well, I just wanted to echo what you said, Emily. And I think, I think one of, I'll speak as a non-Indigenous scientist. I think we're often very solutions oriented and endpoint oriented instead of maybe being more process oriented. And so we're working on what the answer is before we, know really what the question is. It kind of puts me in mind too of some of the, some of the responses through the TRC, about truth and reconciliation, and some of the, some of the participants, leading with the comment that, well, we really haven't had healing yet. Like we're trying to jump to a place that assumes a trusting relationship that we can work on these things together. And, I think that it's a difficult conundrum of things not moving fast enough and moving too quickly at the same time. So I'm not sure if that's any kind of answer, only that maybe to think about how we're determining what the questions are, and what kind of space and time we're leaving for working on that place of trust that that enables people to discuss what a mutual vision would look like. Because otherwise, I think we can come to the same table and leave again, and really not have communicated much at all.
Yeah, thank you.
If I could add something real quick, I think we have to be somewhat honest with ourselves, right? I don't think Canada or most countries are ready or even capable of completely decolonizing or reconciling, right? Nobody's going to take away half of the university land and put up some Métis condos, right? Nobody's going to give us back Mississauga. When I was in Montreal, I've read a lot of old explorer journals from Jacques Cartier when he was coming down the Saint Laurent, right? And I could identify all these really traditional places that he writes about, all these fantastic agroecological practices taking place, right? Nobody's really going to, give all that back, right? So, generally as a society, we're not ready. We're probably even not capable to incur those costs, right? Decolonization, to make sure that's not recolonization, does require somewhat of a complete reworking, but there's going to be a lot of costs for those people already involved in these systems if we want to actually meet those concepts versus kind of just tacking on over these structures. And I think you can still drive change by tacking on and changing the infrastructure from the top. But it still needs to somehow hit those foundational pillars. You need to access that core somehow to slowly start changing that. And even when we do, right, we know that it's never going to be a perfect solution. There will still be thousands of things we can't change. And I think we just have, we don't have to accept it, but I think in reality, I think that's the case.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. And time flies, so I see it's a little. It's 4:11. So I'm going to ask Crystal to remind us again how the audience could ask some questions for the panelists.
Great, thank you, Anamika. So yeah, you'll see at the bottom of your screen www.slido.com, and when you get there, you'll need to enter the event code #IndigSci, INDIGSCI, and we'd love for you to share some comments or questions for our speakers today. We do have a few questions lined up here, but before we do that, I had asked where are people watching from. So it seems like a lot of our viewers today are from the Winnipeg Treaty 1 area, but we also have Stonewall and Steinbach, so people are all over the province today. And I'll throw out the first question just to get you folks thinking about it. This comes from Karen Wittenberg, and the question is, when we discuss science with members of the more remote Indigenous communities, how are we communicating the shared value of their involvement?
Yeah, I'll chime in quickly, and that is a bit of the difficulty, right? I think these remote communities have very different priorities, even if we feel like we understand food security issues, whatever biodiversity issues these remote communities might have. When we bring in something talking about science, we're already really narrowing the box, right? We're saying we're going to influence science and we'll improve this very small aspect of this topic. Right, we're not talking about utilizing the science, figuring out how to make it even valuable to start influencing policy and how that policy will, improve your control or access to all sorts of things. We're talking about it at a relatively small scale when those big changes that I'm sure those communities are looking for need to involve more than just scientists. They need to involve policymakers. They need to involve politicians. They need to be promoting all these other aspects to actually address those problems that they would be interested in talking with you about regarding science.
Thanks, Kyle. Erika or Emily, would you like to add, or should we go to the next question?
I'll have a go. I think thinking about what the relevance is. I think when you're in a Southern-based institution, and yeah, as has been explained to me, because I come from a Southern place, going to a more Northern Indigenous community. So a community liaison officer in the community has observed that researchers, non-resident researchers who visit, view it like as a I don't want to be pejorative, but like as a field trip, that it's something new and exciting for them. And I don't think that when you're visiting a community on a 2-week basis, even if you do that for 2 weeks for 10 years, that you can ever really develop enough of an understanding of what priorities are in a community. And I think that's sometimes why there may be kind of stumbling blocks in developing those relationships where you actually do work as partners, because I think when even just the terminology that we use around, a remote community, like for the people who live there, the university is remote. Where people live in their community is at the center of life. So I think it's still, we need to back it up further and see as researchers, as non-resident scientists, how do we ensure that the support is there for community members should they wish to address their own issues, because in 10 years of 2-week visits, you're still not going to be asking questions at a deep enough level to understand an approach, not just the issues, but the approaches which would be appropriate in the context of that community. So I think it's more a question of the question we should be asking ourselves is, how do we ensure the supports are there for Indigenous scientists and Indigenous communities and Indigenous knowledge holders and leadership to be doing the work that's important in the community. As a resource-rich institution, I know it may not feel like that sometimes in a university, but relatively speaking, we are.
Yeah, thank you for that, Erika. That's the example you gave of the word remote. I think it's a great example. Thank you for that. Crystal, you said you had a range of questions, so maybe we're ready for the next one.
My next question is actually addressed to Erika. It says, what types of engagement activities do you find the most helpful for sharing knowledge and advancing your scientific purpose?
Oh boy. Well, some of the impromptu ones have been the best. Makkovik has an annual trout festival, and the time that I was wrangled into participating in the swim race, which was between the two piers at the fish plant, with icebergs floating offshore, in which I placed last, but sure, made a lot of people laugh. So I think the engagement activities where you can be yourself and not the ones that you necessarily have to have ownership of yourself, but what opportunities are there for you to engage with a community on the terms of that community. So how do you participate in life? How do you be a good visitor? How do you demonstrate your affection for people on an ongoing basis? So in terms of kind of those are maybe the longer term types of engagement, but I think just being able to laugh at yourself in pretty much everything that you do is a good kind of engagement. I won't take up any more time, but if you're welcome to get in touch, and if you're looking for ideas, and I can tell you about lots that didn't work, so you can go from there.
But definitely laughing at yourself is an important one. Yeah. Emily, Kyle, would you like to add to that?
Food is important. Being out on the land, right? Engage in some of that, tougher work, right? Whether it's cutting trees for lodge poles or things like that, do something that contributes to the community, where you can be out there where everybody's doing something not necessarily culturally focused or anything, but engaging in that hard work to build whatever activity is happening.
I think it kind of touches on the last question too, which is sort of like, what is the value of community involvement? And I feel like that's still so many people. So just disclaimer: a lot of the work that I do is to enable people to go and liaise with communities. But I have been to a few communities myself, and what I've heard and what my experience has been is that those relationships that you form in the community, like those long-term relationships, and just like the personal connection and information that you can share is something of value as well. It's not just about for example, advancing your scientific agenda or your research agenda. And I know that there are researchers out there who say that their lives have been changed as a result of some of the people they've met in community. And, you know, just internally, I've had conversations with colleagues, Indigenous colleagues, you know, and there's a very Western, again, kind of mindset that that personal relationships at work are like a big no-no, right? Like that's unprofessional. And so some of us, though, and you know, maybe I shouldn't say this on YouTube, but like some of us have decided that we're going to be good friends, and that is us decolonizing, you know. And so sometimes it's not so much about saying, you know, like what is the value of community participation in this research project, but it's about sort of valuing each other and having those personal connections and just sharing your lives together.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you. Crystal, I know you have some more questions.
Yes. This one probably for all three. While you were students, what would have been some valuable roles an Aboriginal scholar could have played to improve your university experience?
So I didn't have access to any Aboriginal scholars in my field, but actually all my mentors and the people I went to for advice were people from another equity group, right? These were all female researchers that really told me what to expect, right? They said, Kyle, be ready to face all these things that we've all faced for, you know, decades or even now, and doing things like that. So they really prepared me how to potentially tackle, you know, people might not listen to your science stuff, or people might do this, or people might dress, or, you know, focus on how you wear a hat backwards, or how you dress funny, or all these aspects like that, right? To really be ready and to prepare yourself, because I feel there's multiple, you know, different groups that face that face judgment, right? Because they don't fit into whatever we think the, you know, the heteronormative researcher scientist person looks like. So you know, being able to just share those experiences are nice. And you know, maybe having an Indigenous professional to really boost you along would have been beneficial to really help build community connections with different communities, because I think that's really important for us. Again, me, I'm from Ontario, North Shore of Lake Huron. That's where my community lies. So I'm reliant upon all sorts of other Indigenous scholars here to help kind of adopt me or endear me to the community locally here.
Emily or Erika? Oh, sorry. Yeah.
It's just funny because no, that's okay. It's so funny because you just made me realize that, like, yeah, it's been female scholars that have really helped me along the way too. That they were all non-Indigenous, and I mean that's really I mean, anyway, no, it's been a huge that has been a huge help. And I think, you know, what an Indigenous scholar could have provided me with, and I didn't have any you know, sort of Indigenous academic mentors when I was going through grad school, is sort of understanding, like, that it's okay that your Indigenous worldview doesn't necessarily always fit in with the Western scientific worldview, because you're going through that process, and you have like colleagues, like really close colleagues or students, you know, your student peers telling you, you know, yeah, and you know, they believe in the Sasquatch and stuff like that. Like they're saying that to your face, you know what I mean? And I think people just don't even realize the types of things that they say to other people. And so I think it would have been like, I'm working with an Indigenous scholar now at work, and I told her about sort of the struggles I had framing my research questions, because I was much more storytelling oriented than sort of like get to the point. And she said, oh my God, I had the exact same problem. And like in a matter of 2 minutes, I felt so much better, you know? So it would have been great, to have that kind of support along the way, for sure.
And I would say from my perspective as a MSc student, it would have improved the science. You know, my MSc was looking at determinants of species richness and community structure in the coastal barrens of Nova Scotia. And it was a long time after my MSc that it was an Indigenous scholar who pointed out to me, when looking at you know, biogeography, you know, that distribution patterns and that ecological patterns, you know, everywhere, like in every corner of the world, have been structured for thousands of years by Indigenous peoples living and working and shaping the landscape. And do you think I had a single human factor in the determinants of species richness patterns in my MSc? No. And that's an embarrassment to me. And so like hard stop, it would have improved the science.
Thank you, Erika and Emily and Kyle. I think given the time, Crystal, maybe one more, or if there are two short ones, we can do two more.
Okay. Do you have any suggestions for a recruitment approach for bringing in more Indigenous professionals into organizations and onto boards?
If anything, make it worth it to them as well, right? I know it's, looks good. It really benefits those organizations and those boards to have those, Indigenous people sitting on them. But oftentimes it doesn't do as much for that particular Indigenous person's career, right? Say in my example, right? I'm probably maxed out for my service, right? I just did my annual activity report. I have too much damn service. I should be focusing somewhere else. So until it becomes potentially more valuable in some other ways, right? It's hard to justify taking that time sometimes.
Yeah, I don't think we have enough time for all of my thoughts. I would say that how do you bring people in? It's exactly what Kyle said, right? It has to be a reciprocal relationship. So you have to know upfront, like, what are they getting out of it, and what are you asking for in exchange, right? And I think a lot of people don't kind of think of that. And then, I mean, the other thing, like I've been in a lot of processes where we're trying to bring in, or an institution is trying to, construct an Indigenous board or an Indigenous body, and oftentimes they'll have like either no Indigenous people on, working on that project to bring those people in, or they'll have one. And in my experience, it's always better to have a couple of those Indigenous voices, like having those real genuine conversations from the from the beginning of like, so what am I going to get out of this, guys? And being able to have those upfront conversations, I think, is really helpful. So again, for me, it's always going back and building those internal relationships with your existing Indigenous employees too.
I'm going to echo something Emily said. Oh, sorry, Anamika. Just briefly, something Emily said earlier as well. Make sure there's support. Like, don't just hire a single new faculty member who is an Indigenous scholar. And I'll also say, while you're thinking about recruitment, think about retention and think about career advancement. I had it explained to me today, and I had a good laugh because it was a perfect analogy. It's like, it's like being a telecommunications customer. Like, there's all these great incentives when you sign up, but then a year down the road, you say, well, why can't I get a deal like my neighbor? And they say, oh, it's been for a long time. So that there's less value placed on people who are already, perhaps within faculty than, and making sure that they have the supports they need to excel. So I would say, when you're thinking about recruitment, think about retention.
Thank you very much. Well, I wish we had more time. I really am enjoying the conversation and questions, great questions, I think. But this has to come to an end, and I hope that you have been enjoying the faculty conversation, just like I have. You may want to know that we're not done yet, so stay tuned for the next conversation, and that will take place on March 17th on a Wednesday again, and we will be joined by my colleague, Dr. Jitendra Poliwal, who is the Associate Dean Academic and Graduate Programs. And Jitendra will speak about his research in the Department of Biosystems Engineering, along with his colleagues, Colin Gilmore and Kurt Hildebrand. And they will be presenting on innovative technology that has been developed at the University of Manitoba for grain bin monitoring. So watch for our updates. You can look at Make Manitoba. We frequently communicate through that website. And if you have done not so already, you can also sign up for our Ag E-News and you can email us at the email address that is provided on your screen. With that, I want to thank Emily, Erika, and Kyle again for your wonderful dialogue. I really, really enjoyed it. And I wish everyone good night, and thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.